Welcome everybody, my name is Christian and today I'm going to go a quick guide over how to play Axis and Allies. There's many different versions of Axis and Allies. There's this one, which is the spring of 1942. There's a 1941 edition. There is a Pacific edition. There is a Europe edition. There's a Battle of the Bulge, D-Day edition. There's many different editions, but a lot of it comes down to certain basic points as well as certain rules and guidelines that I'm going to go over in more generalities. So watching this video could help you in nearly every Axis and Allies. So any of the Axis and Allies where you actually have traditional production, each country is worth it, each region is worth a certain amount of points. The Eastern United States, which is hard to see on there, it's 12, as well as the Caucasus are 4, and the Siberia territory is only worth 1. So each territory has a varying degree of strategic significance as in terms of choke points. Like Egypt is actually very important, even though it's worth only 2 points. If you control Egypt, more likely than not, you control all of the other points in Egypt, which are only worth 1 or 2 each, but the whole of the continent can, except for northern Egypt, except for northern Africa and Algeria or Libya, but for the most part, you can control most of the bulk of the continent by controlling Egypt. And there's a few other important choke points like that, such as the Caucasus and India. But we'll go over that further. So each territory is worth more, and so for the most part, you want to prioritize higher strategic value points, as well as the ones that, in terms of army composition, you can be able to defeat, as well as those that you're going to be able to hold on to. However, sometimes it's worth to do a push into a capital, even if you know you're not going to be able to hold it, because you're going to be able to take that money and really disrupt their production for at least a turn. Certain territories start out in the game with factories. This includes in Germany, in Southern Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the Eastern United States, in the Western United States, Japan, the Caucasus, and Russia. You can choose to build additional factories, and probably the best location to build another one, particularly for the British, would be to place one in India. You can only build as many troops as its point value is worth, so it would be 3, but you could put 3 fighters there or 3 tanks. If you put a factory in India, you're way more likely to, one, hold on to India, as well as hold on to Egypt, be able to support the Caucasus better, as well as, when the time is right, push into Japanese territory. Because if you build a tank in India, since it can move it can go over to the Caucasus, or it could move over to Transjordan and then Egypt in the next turn. So India is a particularly good place for an additional factory, and in terms of the number of additional factories ever built in a game, I would say 80% of the time it's in India. Other possible locations would be somewhere on the mainland for Japan, but you wouldn't want to put a factory right next to another factory, because then you're just going to be trading tanks and fighters fighting each other. You just as well put someplace else in which where they don't have such an easy counter for you. But for the most part, India is the most common location to build an additional factory. Factories are where you actually build your units. So at the end of every turn, you count up the number of territories that you have, and you get a certain amount of industrial production certificates, which is more or less the money. And each one is supposed to represent 10 million a million man hours of production. So this 10 is worth 10 million man hours of production, and that's exactly what the cost of a fighter is. So if you have 10, you can buy yourself a fighter. If you have 15, you can build yourself a bomber. Certain countries are going to be building more certain units than others just due to their overwhelming wealth. The United States starts out at 42 points and is probably going to hold on to the bulk of those points for the majority of the game if they're playing correctly, because so many of their points are actually in the United States itself, which is very hard for another country to get to. The 4 combined in China will likely be lost, and maybe Alaska will go back and forth, but for the most part, the United States is going to hold on to its territory. Germany, on the other hand, starts out with 40 points, almost as rich as the United States, but can vary quite wildly, both positive and negatively, depending on how the war is going in both against Russia, if the United States is a landing in Norway or in Western Europe, or if British forces are able to take any of Africa as well as Southern Europe in later games. Russia is almost always going to be poor. Luckily, they have a concentration of wealth in their own way of 12 points in both Russia and the Caucasus. This is half of their entire value of, actually, a bulk of their entire value is in those two territories, and it would behoove them to hold on to these two territories. Holding on to your capital is always important, since whenever you lose it, you lose any money that you currently have left over and gets handed to your enemy, and unless you have an additional factory, you usually have a much harder time building and doing a counter attack. So holding on to the Caucasus and Russia are definitely a very strong point. In order to do this, you could either play it safe and control Archangel, West Russia, and the Caucasus and have just a line in the sand, or you can just, if you're falling back on harder times, you could just keep strong levels of forces in both Russia and the Caucasus, and that will protect the rest of your territory unless Japan is also moving in on you. In order to hold the Caucasus, you would likely need help from the British, particularly if they have a factory in India, and make sure that you request that, as well as getting fighters flown in to your important cities can be very, very important in order for you to hold on to that Western Front. And I know the United States and the United Kingdom would prefer to hold on to their own money and their own fighter crafts and be able to use it for their attacks, but throwing in 1 or 2 fighters into Russia can make a huge difference, because Russia is going to be building a bulk of just infantry and tanks and some artillery, and having those dice that roll 4s in defense is going to make a huge difference when they're being attacked by waves of German tanks. As things go better for the Allies, of course, they'll eventually move forward, and maybe they'll be able to have a defensive line of these 3 rather than further back. But for the most part, this is what the Eastern Front is going to be. And once you lose the capital, you're all but done for, because that is such a huge percentage of your total monetary value, and you're only going to be able to build in the Caucasus. And if you've lost Russia, you've probably already lost the Caucasus. And it's not worth building a factory anywhere else, because there were so few points that you would only be able to build 1 or 2 units in addition. So for the Russians, they have to build a lot of infantry, they have to request help from their allies, and just hold out until Germany is weakened, and then you can do a great counterattack, because as you push forward into the German territories, you can significantly increase the value, because this is 2, this is 2, this is 3, this is 3, this is 3. This is a much more economically rich than what the territories that you're used to having. For the United States in Germany, the game, in my opinion, really falls on your shoulders to win or lose. Russia has to hold out, and if they fall quickly, the game could be over. And the British, they can harass both the Japanese and the Germans, but the game really isn't going to hinge on them all that much. The game really depends on Germany and the United States. Same thing with Japan. Japan's actually a great country for beginners to start out with, because an aggressive, active Japan can both eat away at the British, the United States, and the Russians. However, it's very hard for Japan to lose its capital itself, because it's the only capital that is an island. It's much easier to defend an island because there is limitations of how many ground troops they can bring by the number of transports that they have, as well as if you have any fighters or bombers on the mainland, as they get closer to you, more of your fighters and bombers will be able to be pulled into the fight, while less and less of theirs will be able to pull in. So Japan is, if anyone's the newest player who you're going to play with, I would have them be set as Japan. Always give your most experienced player probably Germany, and then next to that, the United States. The United States is going to start out being a very minor player, actually, because it takes a while to ramp up. Even though they're worth 42 points, in order to get the units from the eastern United States to the United Kingdom, landing in Algeria, landing in Western Europe, it takes time. And also, you want to bulk up your forces so you're not just sending them just to be slaughtered. Like, even if you send some transports in turn 1 and land troops in Algeria, there's a good chance you're going to lose those transports. So you may want to either, depending on how many British ships survive, you may want to join up with them, move troops through Canada so you can move them that way. There's multiple different approaches you can do, but it takes time, specifically on the Pacific front. It takes time to build up a fleet, and build up a fleet large enough to destroy the Japanese fleet. And in my opinion, island hopping around here is great, because there's a lot of relatively easy pickings for points. Of the East Indies and Borneo are both 4 points. The Philippine Islands are 3. If you have a superior navy, you'll be able to take those points for relatively ease, and then you take those points away from the Japanese towards you, and then you can start working on the main island. But try to keep the Japanese navy in check. You don't want them to get too large. Or if they do, build so many bombers that it will frighten them from ever leaving their shores and keep them contained. And that's the overall strategy of what the different countries should be doing. It's a fun game. I enjoy it. It gives you some interesting perspective of how things could have gone. In terms of the combat, there are 3 different types of ground units, 2 air units, and 5 naval units. And they have slightly different looks depending on the country. As you can tell, the German bomber looks slightly different than the US bomber, and so on, and they're always different colors. So there's infantry, artillery, and tanks, and then there are fighters and bombers, and then there's transports, submarines, destroyers, battleships, and aircraft carriers. Depending on the version of your game, you may not have destroyers and artillery. Those are relatively new additions. Well, not relatively new in terms of a decade, but those are the 2 newest additions to the game, so some of the older versions will not have them. Infantry have always been the cheapest unit. They're only worth 3. They attack at a measly 1. They move at a 1, but they defend at a 2. So it actually makes, they have some level of defense just in terms of numbers, the number of dice you're going to be rolling, that you roll at a 2, as well as how cheap they are. You can afford a lot of them. Artillery, if they're used in your game, is a great middle way between tanks and artillery. They're worth 4 points. They also move at 1. They attack and defend at a 2. So they're better at attacking than infantry are, but they're just as good at defense, but they cost a little bit more. However, what makes them particularly good in terms of offense is for every artillery that you have, when it's paired with an infantry, that infantry also attacks at a 2 instead of just a 1. So it's always good to have infantry and artillery paired together if you can, particularly if you know if you're going to do an attack. Tanks are great for both attack and defense. They have an attack and defense value that are the same at 3. They move 2, and they cost 5. So they're more expensive, but that second movement is particularly useful. Also, if you don't attack if there's no units to fight against, you can actually take 2 territories if the first one has no units. So if a German tank or if an American tank lands in Algiers, the next turn they can liberate Libya if there's no troops in it, and then go to Egypt and either support the British that are there or attack the Germans that have taken over. Whenever you're doing an attack, it's actually best to have a mix of all 3 of these. Infantry to take the bulk of the damage and the hits. Whenever your enemy rolls hits, you get to choose who takes the casualties. Now, obviously, it's better to have the infantry take the early hits rather than your more expensive tanks, fighters, or even bombers that you want to protect at all costs since they're so expensive. So that is the ground troops. The aircraft are fighters, which attack at a 3 and defend at a 4, which is very impressive, and they have a movement of 4, and I'll go into that more later. And then bombers have a defense of only 1, but they attack at a 4. So there's a huge lopside of which one is the offensive vehicle and which one is the defensive vehicle. You don't want to rely on your bombers for defense because one, for the cost, they're absurdly poor at the job, as well as if you lose each one of them, that's 15 production that has just gone out the window. But for attack, they're particularly useful and can lay on some really heavy damage, particularly if you have heavy bombers, which we'll discuss later. In terms of naval units, there's transports, which can carry 2 points worth of items, which can either be 2 infantry, 2 artillery, 1 of each, or one tank and an infantry. So it's so whenever you do your transports, make sure that you try to have two units on each thing, but you can't put 2 tanks on the same transport ship. There's submarines, which have an attack and defensive 2 and cost 8 points. However, something that's unique about them is if there's no destroyer on the other team, you get to roll your submarines first, and any of the casualties that take place during that roll, they don't then get to counterattack. So essentially you're doing a sneak attack, but if you have a destroyer, that ability is muted and then it just attacks as normal. Destroyers are 12 points. They attack and defend at a 3. All these ships move at a 2, by the way. So they're stronger than submarines, but weaker than battleships. They cost half as much as a battleship. So they're a good ship to include in fleets, particularly if your enemy is building a lot of submarines. Battleships are super expensive. They're 24 points. They attack and defend at a 4, which is very impressive. A lot of, highly odd, you're highly likely to land a strike. And what's interesting about them is they're the only object that has 2 health instead of just 1. So a battleship can absorb 1 hit, in which you signify by putting on side when you assign that damage. And as long as it doesn't suffer a second hit in that turn, it will, at the end of the turn, it will go back to being at full health. So battleships are a great way to buff your fleet in order to take a certain amount of damage and not lose any ships at all. So if you have, two battleships in a cluster together, they can absorb the hits that normally would cost you a transport or a submarine or an aircraft carrier. So they have their uses, but they're so expensive that mostly the United States will be building probably the most of them, and then Japan will as well. So the aircraft carriers are 16 points. They attack with only 1, but they defend at a 3. But they have the unique ability that you can land fighters, only fighters, not bombers. You can land fighters on them. And if the fighters are on the aircraft carrier, they also defend with the fleet. So you will get their defense of 4. So a fully loaded aircraft carrier is amazingly defensive, because not only does it defend itself at a 3, but it can hold up to 2 fighters that also defend at a 4. It should also be noted that fighters are only 10 points, while all these ships, except for the transport and the submarine, are worth more than that. So before you lose a destroyer or a battleship or the aircraft carrier itself, you can lose a fighter if you're required to take casualties. So carriers are very useful, and particularly in the Pacific battles, they're a great way to move air power up along once it's out of the range of your coastline. So combat works with dice rolls, as you can mention before with the values that I was given before. And so what happens is you determine what vessels and aircraft are going to converge on the 1 point during your turn. And unlike most games where you get to do one action and then your enemy does one action, it's all determined by turns. And so the one side gets to do all the actions that are available to them that they want to do, and then the next country goes and does their actions. It should be noted, whenever you're converging your attack, your fighters and bombers always need a theoretical place to land, even if it may be destroyed during the course of the battle. For example, if this aircraft carrier and bomber and battleship go in and attack this fleet, aircraft from the western United States can actually participate in it because they have a movement of 6, so 1 for the ocean, 1 for the sea around the Hawaiian Islands, 1 for Wake Island. So that's 1, 2, 3 to get there. To get back, it would be 1, 2, 3 to get back. So it's a quite impressive range of how far they can go. So even bombers on the western can supplement an attack that's going out all the way in Wake Island. And even if it was further away, like in the Caroline Islands, they wouldn't be able to land back, but they could land in in Hawaii instead. Also, if the Japanese lose their aircraft carrier, but a certain number of their fighters survive, they can choose, depending on their range, of where they would like to land to if their home ship is destroyed. So you have attack and defense go back and forth. For the most part, units that are treated as casualties, they still get to roll their turn for the attack unless they're being attacked by a submarine, in which they're removed from the attack pool right away. Except, of course, if it's a battleship and it absorbs 1 hit, then it will obviously still be able to attack back, but unless you choose to have both of the hits go against the battleship. So that's the gist of how to play. I hope this has been helpful. It's a fun game. It takes a long time, particularly depending on the moves that you have. Try to work together with your teammates. choose countries and strategies and regions that you're going to focus on, and just play with practice and you'll get better and better over time. For the most part, protect your bombers. Try to be point effective in what you're buying. Russia can buy one bomber, but it is way better served by having 3 tanks than having one bomber. But occasionally you want to have maybe a fighter in order to get that 4 defense roll, stuff like that. Same thing with Germany. If your slower troops are moving forward, then your next turn maybe you should build tanks so they can join up and meet with them rather than more infantry that will take additional time to get there. You gotta know when to cluster units together for defense and when to add like a front, when to add traps. Also, don't attack. Only attack when the odds are in your favor heavily. Don't depend on just luck, because this game can be all but lost if you throw the bulk of your army into something and they just get ground up. So that's my advice, and I hope you found this helpful. Bye, everyone.